Happy Saturday, wherever it is, whenever it is, where you are. I am Christy, and we're going to do a quick little, hopefully not more than 30-minute show that will help set up the book club that I'm sort of starting. I'm not quite sure how this is all going to work, but we'll figure it out as we go. Sorry, also, I've not spoken yet today. These are the first words out of my mouth, so if I need a little practice and warm-up time, that's why. All right, let's talk a little bit about what the aim of this kind of pre-book club discussion is, and what I want to get through today, and how this should link up to the book itself. So we're going to be looking at a very, very famous book in sociology called The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckmann, or Luckmann and Berger. I don't know which order they should be going in, but those are the two authors. We are going to set this book up because when you open up the book, it's not really intuitive as to what they want to talk about. And although they do explain things, it kind of assumes a lot of background knowledge. So I wanted to just take a step back and think about and just do a discussion about the ideas of ontology, and that is what exists, and what does it mean to exist, what can we say exists, and then the next question is epistemology. Okay, if we think that these things exist, how do we know about them? How do we come to knowledge about what we think exists? And we're going to be looking at this from a sociology, a societal, anthropological, sort of the human perspective of reality, not just a physical materiality. So let me share my screen with you a little bit. I can show you what's going on. All right, so the book that we're going to be looking at here is The Social Construction of Reality, as you can see. And the way that I'm going to set up the book club kind of thing is that we're going to do fair use. So fair use or fair dealing allows for educational purposes a portion of a book to be used without violation of copyright. We can take up to like 10%, a whole chapter out of a book, or 10% of a chapter or something like that, and not run afoul of copyright infringement. So I'm going to have to think very carefully what in every chapter we can display and really go in depth here. But the idea is I'll try to pull out the main ideas from the chapter, the section that we're going to be looking at. So this is the book itself. If you want to get a copy of it, either a physical copy, a cheap one, or an online copy, whatever you decide. But as you can see from looking at the contents, we'll just go over this quickly. They talk about the sociology of knowledge. And I think that this is an important thing to start off with, just to define the scope of the book. These are sociologists, so they're going to come at it through a sociological perspective. And by that, they're not going to look too much or dig too much into human individual psychology, right? They're not going to be looking at individual level kinds of thinking. They're going to look at what happens in groups, what happens in the aggregate, what do societies do, how does the mass of teeming minds come together and form consensus and structures and whatnot. And their question is, all right, if we accept that knowledge are facts produced in a society, and within that society, that knowledge helps to structure and guide and frame things, how does knowledge get produced? And not just on a sort of like how I do research as an individual. These are sociologists. So they're not looking at the scientific method, for instance, as a method of knowledge production. Because if you've lived in a society, you know that just because something is done with the scientific method doesn't mean it's going to become part of the culture or part of the knowledge base. We have people who think there's a flat earth, all right? So these ideas are not contested. But when you have a culture, a larger group of people, and there is a consensus about what is knowledge, or how societies, the social constructs in that society, what the values are, how people ought to behave, all of those things, how is that produced? How do societies as a group produce knowledge? And they have some really interesting, we're going to look at it a bit later on, but one of the things they talk about is knowledge in everyday life. So the experience of everyday life, social interactions in everyday life, and language and knowledge. And language is going to play a huge role in our understanding of the social construction of reality. We have to be more reflective on the role of language in a social context than I think we do in a scientific one, although I think it is worth questioning the assumptions of the terms we use in science. Because while science tries to be a bit more on the objective side, it can experience bias, the subjective realm is definitely influenced by personal perspectives. So knowing something about the language being used and the values inherent in that language and how those values shape society is quite important. And they're going to talk then about institutionalization and legitimation, as we'll go through. And then in section 3, we're going to look at society as a subjective reality. So before we go on too much, because again, already we're getting into some pretty heavy terms that might obscure or become a bit of a barrier to understanding what the book is about. I think the best way to, and by the way, I just want to say hello, Rory Katz, hello, Lonely Wolf, hello, Flint. Anyone else I've missed, I'm sorry, but hello to all of you in the chat. I see you. I want to look at the Wikipedia article because that actually does a pretty good job of framing the basic questions of the book, and also it locates it within the discipline of sociology, and you can understand why I wanted to look at this book and what other people in the discipline think of it. So let's look at a kind of a layman's discussion of what the scope of the book is and what it intends to cover. So The Social Construction of Reality, a treatise in the Sociology of Knowledge, is a 1966 book about the sociology of knowledge by sociologists Peter L. Berger and Thomas Luckmann. Berger and Luckmann introduced the term social construction into the social sciences and were strongly influenced by the work of Alfred Schutz. I don't know who Alfred Schutz is. So, see, even I don't know everything. Of course I don't. The central concept of the book is that people and groups interacting in a social system create, over time, concepts or mental representations of each other's actions. And this is important about the conceptualization, the abstraction of others' actions. Right? So that is step 1. Step 2, these concepts eventually become habituated into reciprocal roles played by the actors in relation to each other. So people set up a system, and then it is by engaging in that system repeatedly that the system itself becomes almost like an institution. So let's think about the institution of slavery. Slavery as a concept and a practice has varied over time. There are, if you go back to Roman times, literally anybody could become a slave. People who were slaves could become free. People who were free could become slaves. So you could get captured and become a slave. You could earn your freedom, whatever else in the fighting galleries or whatever with your master. And whatever the norm was in Roman society, that was people were brought into that system and they were sort of given norms as to what they were allowed to do within that slavery system, their freedom conditions, all that kind of stuff. And then by participating in it, they then sort of make the reciprocal relationships valid and carry it forward and reproduce it. Right? Whereas in a different form of slavery, like American slavery, it was entirely targeted toward one ethnic group. And the way that racism was used and people were not allowed to be slaved created a completely different type of culture that carries through with us today. So we can see that this is the study of, it's not just a study of knowledge, but it's a study of how sort of societies come to accept what is valid, not valid, or contested. All right, so when these roles are made available to other members of society to enter into and play out, the reciprocal interactions are said to be institutionalized. Now, this can be informally through just custom, or it can be written into laws and made more formal, although still just as easily contestable if you do it within a certain system. So the thing about these institutions, though, is that we think they have more existence than they really do. When we think about the Constitution, I think I am not inaccurate in saying we tend to, as an American, let's say from an American perspective, learning about the Constitution, it seems like it's a foundation and a practice that is quite stable. It's written down on paper. We all agree to the rules. Therefore, our democracy is very secure. However, I think as we're learning in the time of Trump, all it requires is someone with power to not agree to play by those rules, and everything starts to fall apart. So our perceptions of things like, the infallibility of the Pope over time or whatever else, these are illusions. They're not really as stable and uncontested as they present themselves as being. So just to understand that, institutional practices that are repeated over time and are formalized maybe through laws or customs or traditions, tend to be handed down as if they are unquestioned knowledge, as if they were the right thing to do, and therefore later generations reproduce them because they make these assumptions about the nature of institutions. In the process, meaning is embedded in society. Knowledge and people's conceptions and beliefs of what reality is become embedded in the institutional fabric of society. So if again thinking about the idea of the American Constitution, it's a good example to look at the ways in which society can sustain an idea over time but also completely transform it. So within the Constitution, I'll give you my example. There is a line, all men are created equal. When that line was written, they had a very narrow conception of men in mind. When that line was written, they were thinking white propertied men who are free, and over the, but basically white men were born equal. Amongst this internal little group of insiders, there was equality. But as passing generations laid claim to that notion of human equality that transcended, your gender or your sex or your economic locations, that it was a principle that was endowed with all humanity to all humanity. It's a principle we extend to anyone who is human about equality. That was the aspiration. And so men kind of became a stand-in for men and women. And now people will just change the language of the Constitution to all people. Now, that's not what the original wording was. It wasn't what the original tension was. But new generations reinvented who qualified as being created equal in order to match the current norms. And yet the sanctity, the solidity, the foundations of that document are not considered less, even though the rights have been expanded. So this is how, meaning is embedded in a society, and these meanings and values end up being institutionalized through language in our practices. And the very end, the last sentence here, therefore, reality is therefore said to be socially constructed. In 1998, the International Sociological Association listed the social construction of reality as the 5th most important sociological book of the 20th century. So this is a pretty, really, important book in terms of understanding how we understand ourselves. It's a self-reflective, how did we get here kind of book, but it's pretty high level if you've gone into some of the early pages. So we'll look a little bit, of course, at the discussion, and then I want to kind of give you my take of this understanding before we go any further, just to get some foundations clear from where I'm coming from, and then we'll talk a little bit about the introduction, and then you'll have your assignment. We'll look at the introduction of the chapter for the next one. And I should say this at the end too. I'm not going to be able to start the book club on this Sunday because I have a ridiculous amount of streaming. Tonight I'm streaming the happy hour. I'm streaming D&D. Then I have my this stream, and then I have Tom's birthday for my patron hangout stream and my Sunday show. That's 5 streams in the next 48 hours. So I needed to break that up. I can't do 4 streams on a day, so I moved it over here to today. So next week we'll take up the first chapter. You can look at the basic concepts. We're going to talk, those are going to come up in the introduction. Social stocks of knowledge and earlier theories often paid too much attention to scientific and theoretical knowledge. This is the critique of Berger and Luckmann. But this is only a small part of social knowledge concerning a very limited group or very limited roles within society. Customs, common interpretations, institutions, shared routines, habitualizations, and the who is who and who does what in a social process, the division of labor, these all constitute what the sociologists in this book would consider a part of knowledge in society. So while they appreciate, and we'll see this, they'll make deference to Scheller and Mannheim, Stark and Marx and Weber, they're not going to be limited to the theoretical and scientific frameworks that these earlier authors were operating within. So just as an FYI, then we talk about semantics. The general body of knowledge is socially distributed and classified in semantic fields, and we'll talk a bit more about this as we get into the chapter. Sorry. The dynamic distribution and interdependencies of these knowledge sectors provide structure to the social stock of knowledge. This is why we're going to talk about this stuff. It's a lot of code words, a lot of industry terms, acronyms, and stuff that we need to unpack and put into layman's terms. Language and signs. Language also plays an important role in the analysis of integration of everyday life. I think actually language frames everything, so I would actually put language is not just an important role, it is the mediating role, but we'll talk about my take in a second. Language links up common sense knowledge with finite provinces of meaning, thus enabling people, for example, to interpret dreams through understanding relevance in daytime. Quote, language is capable of transcending the reality of the everyday altogether. It can refer to experiences pertaining to finite provinces of meaning. It can span discrete spheres of reality. Language soars into regions that are not only de facto, but also a priori unavailable to everyday experience. Oh my God, this language is so dense. So this book is not easy. That's why I want to do the kind of stuff to unpack it a bit more first. Then we're going to be looking at social everyday reality. This is the intersubjectivity of people's experience. We'll look at the idea of society as an objective reality built up through subjective experiences, but then it sort of has an objective, sort of institutionalized reality of its own. Objective social worlds, the division of labor, symbolic universes, universe maintenance. Again, we'll kind of get all, so, and then society is subjective reality. So there's societies that we build up into an objective reality, and then there's also our subjective experiences of that created objective reality. Let's talk a little bit. I'm sorry if this is just a bunch of jargon. I'm hoping we can get to the point where we unpack this stuff. So let's unpack it a little bit. All right, I'm going to give you my take on what exists and how it exists. So this is not like a lecture with a whole bunch of citations and everything. This is a book club. There's no tests at the end of this. There's no mark or grade that you're going to get. There's just the ideas that we're going to be discussing. So before we start the book, I want to just kind of walk through my perspective on what exists and how it exists, how we know it exists, and kind of what it means to understand that social constructs and social constructs pervade our lives. Like, does it end up like driving us to nihilism? I would say no. Okay, so the question of ontology is the question of what exists, and also asks, what does it mean to exist? These are pretty deep questions. But what I'm going to offer as an answer to that question of what exists is that there are two primary forms of existence that conscious beings, human beings, experience. The first is, of course, reality as material existence. Before humans were ever even a possibility of existing, or the possibility of humans of existing was possible. That's a little bit redundant. Anyway, material reality existed. We had the big expansion or the Big Bang. It's kind of a misnomer to say it was a Big Bang. We had chemical, physical processes, all these kinds of things happening, and those material conditions actually resulted in our Earth. And our Earth was in a position in terms of its location to the sun and the kind of chemicals that were available on it, and the billions of years it got to sort of just sit around and do chemical reactions until a self-replicating cell emerged as a possibility after 4 billion years. And that self-replicating cell continued to self-replicate and spread out. We got human beings who, of course, can perceive and are affected by material reality. So we have material bodies. We are subject to the laws of physics. We have chemistry, that's going on, neurological charges and things in our brains. We are material beings. And so material existence obviously has an influence and an effect on our lives. From, let's say, a political science point of view, you can think about this form of material reality as as being having an influence on people's lives through the process of aging, or to like the gender group that you're assigned, you come into, you're born into and you're cis, or you're trans and you identify. This is going to, whichever groups you participate in, this is going to have a sort of an effect on how you experience the rest of your life. There's our natural genetic predispositions or factors that will that are part of our material reality. Now, the difference, of course, if you are cis or trans, if you identify as man or woman or non-binary, if you are whatever ethnic group you are, in and of itself is just a neutral fact. Nature doesn't care. There's no values there. But once you put in conscious minds, then you might say start to associate the cis man with the role of father because of a the natural division of labor. But saying that, for instance, it's wrong, it's undesirable for men to be very soft and cuddly with their kids and to be very emotional, that they need to be the disciplinarians, that is not natural. That is something that society puts in there. All right. So on the one hand, we are obviously confined to our material bodies, and we have stable and repeated and predictable interactions with the material world. So that is one part of our reality. As I write here, material existence, it's inorganic, and then we have, I think I spelled some things wrong here, but whatever. Because the thing is in German, and so I just get really, lose all my confidence with spelling things correctly. So conscious beings, however, in terms of creating a society, when we have a material interaction with another human being, it's not like picking up a rock. Rocks don't have opinions. Rocks can't give us grief. Rocks don't have volition and will, right? Rocks aren't trying to oppress us. And so it is a different form of existence, I would argue, that we experience through through living as a conscious social being within a society. So the second kind of reality that I would argue that human beings experience, in addition to the material reality, is the reality of the society and the individuals and the values and the culture and the language available to us within that society. Because the reason I would say that this is real and it exists is that our social reality can have as much of an impact on our physical well-being as nature. So if you go to the edge of a cliff and you jump off, physics is always going to act in the same way on your body, and you're going to see an impact. Within a social construct, if you are born into a society where your parents were slaves and you are born into slavery because it's, like 1801 or something and you're on a plantation, your physical well-being is as much determined by the society and this that you are born into, and what that society allows and doesn't allow you to do as aging, right? So our society has real effects. Another great way of thinking about social reality and how it determines people's lives and sometimes can kill you is realizing that money is a social construct. If I don't have anything, but let's pretend that this handkerchief that I keep around is actually currency, and it's worth 150 euros, right? It's really just paper. It might even have, like if I had a note, which I didn't bring with me, 100 written on it or 50 written on it. But those numbers in and of themselves are just what we place on this piece of paper to represent something else. And your ability to get these little pieces of paper, even though they have no reality outside of our society, right? There's no inherent value to paper with numbers written on it, can determine whether or not you can get your medicines, whether or not you can keep your heat on. All of this whether or not you're wealthy or poor, this is all a result of a socially constructed economy that we buy into. So there's no inherent value other than the value we give it, and yet it materially determines the comfort or discomfort of a lot of people's lives. So social reality is incredibly powerful, and in many ways, you could maybe make the argument that society has as much, or maybe more, of an impact on the quality of your life and your life experiences than just, say, your genetic predisposition to a health problem or not. The society you are born into will determine whether or not you are able to live with that condition, or if you're going to suffer from it your entire life and really not have a good quality of life. So the social construction of reality is incredibly important to understand, and to understand that we have the power to shape the societies we live in. We don't have to just be handed a bunch of outdated values and reproduce them just like every generation that came before us. And the way that we know how to unpack and undermine and reconstruct people's experience of social reality is by understanding how we produced it in the first place, and then how we can change it. All right. So let's move on a little bit to my other notes. I think that was, So in terms of what exists, as I've said, you've just heard me argue, that I would argue there's a material existence that is independent of our minds, that affects us, we can understand it, and we can to some degree control it, but it is kind of like it's independent of us. And then there is our social reality, which is entirely dependent upon us, and yet we treat it as if it's outside of our control, as if it's, like something that it just exists, and it takes a lot of work to change things around it. So when we look at the social reality, how do we come to have a social reality? So I would say that in the sociology of knowledge, knowledge assumes the existence of a language, and language itself structures what can be known. Language itself sets out boundaries as to what is sort of like what exists and what doesn't. Let me give you an example. If you look at the writings of the Hebrew Testaments and the Christian Testaments within the Bible, there is no discussion of what it means to be a man who has been wronged because another man assaulted you sexually. Oops, sorry. There's no term for that. There's no space in that text for the idea that if a man is a victim of a sexual assault from another man, he has been wronged and he is a victim and he deserves justice. I think the only way you can really deal with that is by condemning both of them. If man lies with man as with woman, kind of thing. So if you are a victim of that kind of abuse in that society, where do you go? You have no way of really giving expression to what's happened to you, because linguistically you're bound in. Now that's not to say you can't invent terms, but that means you have to sort of contest what exists in the language already and point things out. So language and our use of language and the values that are inherent in our terms structure our understanding of the world. If you use the word virgin and you think your default is a woman, and it's a woman who hasn't had sex, and it's a woman who hasn't had sex and is pure, well then virgin isn't just a descriptive term, it's a normative one. It has value with it. And so when you use this term, you're reproducing the assumptions about the values that go along with this word every time you use it. So for me, I think the role of language is incredibly important to understand and reflect on when we discuss how our social realities between individuals is inherited and then reproduced and passed on. So as I said, language is a tool. It's a tool to describe the world, but it's not neutral. Language is value laden. Oftentimes people don't reflect on the values inherent in the language they use, but if you take some time to think about it, then you can unpack the source of it and what it's meant to convey. So my next point would be social structures, norms, and social reality exists as the interaction between, there's a misspelling, language, and humans. So human behavior, I would argue, is influenced and sometimes entirely determined by cultural norms, and these norms are represented through signs and symbols and language and communicating ideas back and forth. That means that social reality is not fixed. Social reality has to be reproduced in every generation. And this is why we see subtle changes to it over time. The example being all men are created equal. This idea of all men are created equal being passed down and expanded and changed and altered to reflect the reality of the society at the time shows that social reality is not fixed. It's not independent of human construction, that it is a reflection of the values our society has agreed upon or is contesting at the time. And so that gives every generation an opportunity to reinvent. Every time point is actually a chance to contest received wisdom and instruction in institutions and practices. So it's when people put too much, let's talk about religious fundamentalists, right? If you take a social construct like religion and you take the religious beliefs that are the foundations and the structure for behavior and attitudes and decisions on what is morally right and wrong, the options that you have in terms of your behaviors within that social religious structure, by making appeals to God and holy texts, what they're attempting to do in some ways is fix understanding in a certain time period. But of course, what's fixed also tends to change by generation, so it's social reality appears or might be discussed as this thing that's out there that's fixed, but really it's constantly being contested. That sometimes makes people who are invested in the structure very uncomfortable, and they don't want contestation, they don't want re-examination. But it is possible. Every idea that we create can be challenged and changed. So interactions with the material world also conditioned upon our existing language and our need for creating new terms. So that's to say that if a concept or an experience doesn't exist linguistically, it's very difficult to make it part of the social construction of reality until you give it a name and a definition and other people acknowledge it as something that they also know. So I think the last thing I wanted to discuss, because I don't think that Berger and Luckmann really bring this up as much, but I think it's important to discuss or note when it comes to the social construction of reality, who gets to decide? Who gets the authority? Who is designated as having authority? Who is recognized as having authority? Whose opinions are deferred to and win out? Well, I don't, this is my speculation. I haven't read any philosophers on this. So just thinking about it, it seems to me that if we look at the social construction of reality and how ideas come to be part of a society or not, there are three ideal types. And by ideal types, I'm not saying these are perfect. What I'm saying is I'm just taking an abstraction of a democratic thing as in its most perfect sense, and then doing a thought experiment. What if society organized itself, its ideas by this way? So if we think about different ways we could construct reality, there is a democratic approach. Basically, any ideas could be thrown out there and used equally. Everyone's terms could be conceived as equally valid as long as you define them and you understand where people are coming from, right? So there's no sense of authority. There is what people have, it's a pure democracy, Athenian democracy. We're talking about mob kind of democracy here. There's no structures. Everyone's got an opinion. You can also think about ideas being produced within a society and knowledge being produced as part of a meritocracy. So an example that I would think in terms of that is the scientific method. The scientific method is a process of knowledge production in which ideas compete for success, and that competition, how that success is measured, is the extent to which a theory or a principle or an idea accurately reflects our perceptions of reality. And the more precise a description and the more perfect a prediction, so description and prediction, of our experience of reality, because it's not reality, we're experiencing it, so it's mediated through our materiality and our consciousness. But if we have something that always does a really good job of predicting the future, like a physics, if you like plot it in, where is something going to land if you shoot it out at this angle, at this speed. If you can predict that incredibly precisely over and over, and you can describe things very well, that's a good theory. All right, and so those theories tend to move forward because they are best at describing reality. That is what I would hold as a meritocracy type of way of producing knowledge. And then I think what we get to last is what I think is actually how most knowledge has been produced over the course of human history, and that is hierarchically. Unwarranted authority, maybe one could say legitimate authority, but it's those in power. And did I spell hierarchical wrong too? I'm having a low confidence day. Is it higher with an E? I don't know. I always look at it higher. I'll leave it that way. Hierarchical. Those in power determine what is allowed, not allowed, and they use power to enforce this. And I would look at that as, we've looked. Just think about history with religious authorities and religious leaders. The people who have the ability, like the wealthy, have the resources and the leisure time to educate themselves, to take opinions on things, and then be sort of opinion trendsetters. Not only do they have the time and leisure to think about ideas, but they actually have the resources to enforce them on others. So I haven't done an analysis of this. My gut instinct is to say that most of the way we experience reality, what exists, what is valued, who is valued, comes from hierarchical forms of power, of decision-making, not through democratic or meritocracy forms of knowledge production. So when you're born into a society that is, let's say, very unfair, it's based, let's say, on, it's an oligarchy, or it's some sort of military junta, or it's an absolute dictatorship and monarchy, which is how most of human societies have ever existed. You are born into the society, and of course the king or the queen will say, I have been designated by God in order to get more legitimacy, in order to become less unstable as a concept and make an appeal to something as permanent as divinity, in order to protect their power and their status and their wealth. All right, so if you are born into Tudor England, the idea of treason, just the mere idea of treason, is probably enough to scare you crapless. So, the idea, so you're not going to be born in the king and his power. Church tells you that it's divine right. The king tells you it's divine right. Your Lord tells you it's divine right. Who are you? It takes a lot of work to kind of question those things. And you can see ideas being contested through Protestantism and the role of the church and the state and a lot of kind of stuff. But when you first look at it, before you examine it, social reality can appear to be quite stable and fixed and beyond reconstruction. But that is an illusion. Social reality, unlike material reality, with 2 L's, is constantly being reproduced and therefore contested and therefore renegotiated, and the possibility for reimagining it comes up. All right. So it's a bit, I guess you could think of social construction of reality is a bit like looking at a rainbow, right? Now, independently, without a human person there, you have light coming in, through the rain, and you have the rain, and you have the possibility, you have the potential of having a rainbow appear, but without a person, you don't have the right combination of factors to bring a rainbow sort of like out, to see the rainbow within this interaction. But when you put a person at the right angle, their eyes, right, they are positioned in a way to have the light, the rainbow that's created through the interaction of light and the water, hit the back of their eyes, and their mind perceives a rainbow that doesn't really exist, right? I mean, the rainbow is there, you can see it, you can describe it, you can draw it. But in terms of its actual existence, if you went looking for a rainbow, you're never going to find it. Right? And social reality, I kind of think of in that same way, in that it kind of exists, but it also kind of doesn't. It exists in the impression it leaves on our minds. But if we were to go out and look for the Constitution or human rights in the world, outside of the documents and the verbal agreements, we're never going to find human rights. But human rights are something that we can perceive by putting together a number of factors and giving a word to the thing that is, you know, we can see with our mind and our eyes and our sensory perceptions and our consciousness. Okay. I mean, these are concepts I'm pretty well internalized, so they're not difficult for me, and I don't know if I've done a great job explaining. It's sometimes hard to explain what you know really well, because it seems really obvious, and so I'm trying to be consciously competent. I'm trying to understand how I understand these things. And I think that by thinking about these things and understanding this part about social reality, it will make understanding the book easier. So the last thing I will leave you with, some homework before we start, and then in the introduction. So I'll show you where in the introduction we need to go. Yep. Let me get the right, before I give you your homework, if you want to read along, we're going to read the introduction here. And the introduction, I'm not going to lie, it's not a light read. And there are going to be people that they refer to that you don't know too much about, or maybe anything at all. And that's fine. Like, you know, again, this is like a book club. We can kind of discuss. Maybe I got to figure out how we're going to do discussions. Maybe you need some kind of bulletin board or posting questions. But anyway, we're going to look at the introduction first. That reality is socially constructed, and the sociology of knowledge must analyze the process of knowledge production. Okay. And so if you can go ahead and look at the introduction, read it slowly. You might need to read it more than one time. You also might need to look up a little bit about some of the other thinkers. But I will say, they say this a little bit at the beginning of the introduction, but it's worth saying again. They're setting up other philosophers who have discussed things that relate to the sociology of knowledge in the past. But their main reason in setting up these philosophers is to say these guys, because again, who gets to determine social reality? It's people with education and power, and that historically has been located with men. So we get overeducated men, not overeducated, but we highly educated men who are here bringing their value system and defining what social reality is. I think it's, again, worth noting. But they're mostly focusing on these philosophers in order to show a gap in the way they think about it. So if you think about it in terms of Marxist analysis, you're really narrowing yourself to the idea of labor and human activities and money, which isn't everything we do. There's a whole lot of being human that doesn't involve our labor. And there are other people who are thinking about things more theoretically. And what Luckmann and Berger want to do is bring this down to the practical. And they want to look at human activities across the board, not just within economics or not just within a theoretical situation. So if you understand that that is where they're coming from, they're basically trying to carve out this gap in the existing understanding or existing contributions to the sociology of knowledge, or how knowledge is produced, and saying we're going to address this practical gap. We're not going to just limit ourselves to the theoretical. We're going to look at how people behave as a sociologist as opposed to a philosopher. So you might have to read it more than once. And if that's the case, you know, I did. Don't feel bad. Sometimes you don't get everything on the first reading. I'm also making a lot of notes here, which we'll talk a little bit more about next time. So then the last thing, so in addition to reading the introduction, maybe twice if you need to, before you do that, I would also recommend watching this video. Where's my video? This video. No, that's me. Where'd my Google thing go? Yeah, oh, here we go. Yes. Let me put a link to this. I'll put the link in the chat. Watch this video. Ooh. There we go. You should be able to click on that. And this woman has her degree in sociology and a master's in psychology. And she does a really nice job of walking through some of these ideas. So let me put my headphones on here for a second. Boop. Okay. That seemed a bit loud. I might need to back that up a little bit. Oh, you can't hear anything because I don't have your sound on. Okay, no, that's better. Now we'll go. It's alright. You haven't, just music. You haven't missed anything. And I see that I'm absolutely huge in the way. So let me move this back over. That way you can see the screen a bit better. I'll just give you a little bit of a sample of this. A Discord? Yeah, we could do a Discord, Lonely Wolf.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another class or another discussion. Today we're going to talk about the social construction of reality, and that the social construction of reality is through interaction among people who use symbols to interpret one another's behavior and assign meaning to perceptions and experience.
Now, as a consequence of listening to me babble on for the last half hour, I hope that sentence makes a lot more sense than it would have if you had just come to the video without any background. So the last thing I would say is, yeah, please watch this video, which I've linked, and I should also put it in the video description. Right, I will do, I don't know if I can I edit a video? Can I edit my video description at the same time I am doing the video? I don't think so. So I'll have to add that afterwards, but you've got it in the chat. It's 36 minutes long. It will make your life so much easier though. And then read the introduction. And I think what we'll do afterwards is next time, I'm trying to think, if we do a Discord, that sounds fine, because then people can post questions, or maybe even video clips. Can you upload video clips? In which case I could play the contribution, or play the question, or play the musings, whatever you want to make in terms of a contribution. And then we can do it kind of interactive. I'm a little bit concerned with the Zoom, doing a Zoom or a Skype, that people wouldn't be able to make it because of international time. So I think, yeah, the contribution or the suggestion for Discord is a really, really good one. I'll get on that, and I will set that up for next time. So let's do this next Sunday. We will have the focus will be the introductory chapter of the social construction of reality. I will set up the Discord, and I will go over what I think are the main points in the introduction and publish the Discord address and let people join. And then between that week and the following week, people can post their understandings, or post their questions, or post their comments. And before we move on from the introduction, we'll have a whole discussion. So this is kind of like pre-introduction stuff that I'm giving you, and then we'll review the introduction and the main points. And then in the third week, we'll have a discussion, and then we'll start on chapter 1, or a section of chapter 1 moving forward. Okay, so that seems like a plan to me. I want to just take a little bit of time to talk to the chat. I know you guys have been talking and saying things, and I have been mostly focused on getting these ideas out of my head accurately. No, this is the wrong one. Hold on, let me go. I'm going to try to make your font a bit bigger. Yeah, there you go. There we go. Okay. Now you're awfully big. Now you're almost too big. Chat. Okay. So if you have any things that you want to say before, or suggestions, what if we live in an idiocracy? I'm pretty convinced we do. Okay. Let's see. We use meowing to create a conducive environment. Okay. Cat jokes. Bird beat grinding services. You guys are silly. All right. I'm getting it. I have read a bit of philosophy, though. It helps to read philosophy. I think if it's coming to this cold, it can be a bit of a shock to the system. Discord would be awesome. You got it. I will set that up. I'm admin in a server. Okay, thank you so much. I can add links. Click the link, and it took me away from our lovely chat space. Oh, no. Okay, well, I will let you guys get on with watching this very good video. There are also, if you just look at the social construction of reality, there are other videos that you can watch, so you don't have to limit yourself to this one. I think if we do the social construction of reality, there's yes, a whole series of people that you can listen to. So if this particular speaker isn't kind of clicking with you, or you want to hear it again, sometimes it helps to hear the same explanation from a slightly different perspective, or in a slightly different way, to really make it, oh, now I get it. Okay, go ahead and help yourselves. I think that's about it. Yeah, I wanted to only go half an hour, and I already went 50 minutes. So what is on board for tonight? Well, just so you guys know, there's going to be a happy hour on Kevin's channel. I don't know if he set it up yet, but we agreed to do something on Saturday night. And then I've got my usual standing Dungeons & Dragons, which is our escapism from life, because we all need a little bit of escapism these days. Then tomorrow is Weekend Winters at the usual time, and then my patron hangout, where we'll be celebrating Flag Day and my longtime friend Tom's birthday. So you can join me for any or all of those, especially if you're like subscribed to me on Patreon, even though I'm not asking for money anymore because other people probably need it more than me and I've got all my equipment. But it's just sort of left out there because, well, basically I take the money that I make from Patreon and I repurpose it to other creators like Steve Shives and Chrisiosity and who else is like, I don't know, like 7 or 8 people that I support with my patron funds. So redistribution in that way. Is the and not safe for work section for Kevin, yes. D&D, I wish you had more time. You can always just listen back at any time. You don't have to come live. There's a whole playlist of us doing our D&D stuff. You can just throw it on before you go to sleep and do it. Thanks for doing it. Promises to be very interesting. I've studied philosophy as a hobby, but learning in a casual group will be fun. I hope so too. And I hope people will feel more secure in their understanding. And also I hope it will really help them explain to other people how reality is socially constructed. And in a way, language and signs and symbols are, in my opinion, are the filter through which we perceive everything materially or socially. But we oftentimes don't think about language like the same way fish don't think about the water that they're swimming in, because we are surrounded by language. It's so innate, it's so reflexive to us and natural that we don't think to question it. And in that case, you should go look at Wittgenstein, who had some really good stuff on language. Anyway, until later on tonight, or tomorrow, or another time in the future. I've been Christy. You guys have been awesome. Thank you so much for stopping by. I will get going on the Discord, and I will put that up, I guess, not this on Sunday. I'll do another video. I'll sort it out, and I'll get it to you guys. So until next time, I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Enjoy the reading, enjoy the research, enjoy the thinking, and we'll see each other again very soon. Bye.